AI to Go podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to the AI to Go podcast. My name is Johannes and we help you turn AI pilots into clear business outcomes. Today's guest is Ted Shelton. He's advised Fortune 500 companies on everything from cloud computing to automation to AI at Bain & Company. He served as the chief operating officer at Inflection AI until last summer, and he rebuilt the company from zero after the founding team joined Microsoft. Ted is a philosopher by training, and he thinks very deeply about key questions around human qualities in the AI age. So I'm super excited for our conversation today. Welcome to the show, Ted.
Thank you, Johannes.
Great that you're here. I saw that you are a daily user of Waymo in San Francisco, so the automotive vehicles, and you've actually defended the data showing that they are safer than humans. Why do you think so many people are still skeptical of autonomous vehicles?
Well, I think there's two threads of skepticism. One thread is economically self-motivated, which is, and in fact, there is a group in San Francisco that has gotten started up that's protesting Waymo and asking for it to be rolled back. And some of the participants in that group, I'm not saying all, are clearly, though, in their own words, are motivated by the fact that they're afraid they're going to lose their jobs. They're taxi drivers and Uber drivers and other things, right? So I think there's an element here in which, and this is a thread that we should be thinking about across our whole society, in which these technologies are causing displacement from current roles, and that's unsettling, and so people are going to be opposed. I think there's a broad-based skepticism across the society for AI and its ability to do tasks that we think of as human-level tasks. And so I do think there's a proportion of the resistance which is simply about saying, hey, well, and look, there are things that have happened, right? So San Francisco had a power outage, and during that power outage, Waymo cars lost connectivity to the network and so pulled over, right? And so there's a concern that, hey, we don't actually have the tools in place to be able to manage an autonomous vehicle fleet if we have some black swan event, right? And while I sympathize with the job loss issue, and I agree with the challenges around operational continuity through every different possible experience, and I nonetheless think that Waymo cars are so much safer than human-driven cars. I'll tell you, so personal thing for me, I live right in downtown in the financial district. I get up every morning and I'm usually out the door at 4:30 a.m. because I go and I take an hour-long walk and walk up Coit Tower. And so I see the behavior of vehicles in the streets when the drivers don't think that there are any humans around that they could kill with their vehicles. And they drive the wrong way on one-way streets. They run stoplights. They drive erratically. They speed because they think that they can do anything. And the Waymos don't. The Waymos follow the rules, right? And so then, that level of awareness, because of my 4:30 to 5:30 a.m. walks, I started noticing all the time cars turning illegally on a red light where they shouldn't be turning, or not stopping. And you can't possibly look at the data, like forgetting the anecdotes, and say that human drivers are safer than Waymo. Waymo is clearly safer. And so we need to go through that disruption of jobs and figure out what people are going to do for a living. We need to go through the learning curve of the operational activities that could be disrupted, so we understand how to handle those things like a power outage, and we will arrive at a better society. And that's what we've done throughout human existence, is invented new affordances that have allowed us to improve the quality and the duration of high quality life that we have. This is just another example.
I think Waymo is just interesting for the first 5 minutes. And then you're like, okay, this is like essentially an experienced driver that'll get me anywhere I want to, right? So it's exciting in the first couple of minutes. And then it's like, okay, it's working.
Yeah, it works. Yeah.
Interesting, but I think the societal implications, and we'll get into that later on. Now, with all the Moldbot craziness over the weekend, I saw that you also working on some fun little side project. You'll tell me, what do you do with RP, and like what is the basic idea that you're working on?
Yeah. So Alpi, AALPI.ai, was a project that I started because I started thinking a couple of months ago, actually, about a transition in the way in which we engage with AI, where ChatGPT was fantastic in November 2022 for introducing people to the possibility that a machine could interact in a human-like way. And so it created this sort of visceral experience for people that woke them up and said, hey, I should be paying attention to this technology. The downside is it established a particular pattern of interaction, of dialogue. And while that is useful for some use cases, it is not for all. And I think others also, Ethan Mollick recently wrote about delegation. And I think, so this is a couple months ago, I started working on the idea of how do we actually change the interaction model to delegation? And so I was playing with a messaging interface with iMessage and learning how to use iMessage as an interaction model to be able to trigger actions that would be executed by AI. And then Cloudbot launched. And I mean, I actually launched maybe 6 weeks ago, but certainly caught everybody's attention in the last week as it's reached virality in the news media, and the open Claude bots are now all talking to each other in a social network of their own, right? So suddenly that's, of course, another whole level of crazy. But so what I saw in that was two really interesting things that I think people should be thoughtful about. One is there is this very powerful capability of having an AI personal assistant that has access to all of your information and all your passwords and can do tasks on your behalf. There is also the flip side of that coin, an incredibly dangerous security posture of giving this Claude bot your passwords and your access to all your data and all the rest, right? And so what I'm attempting to do with Alpi is provide a safe alternative, which, by the way, by necessity, then will sort of ease into having more complex task execution and more robust information access, because I want to figure out how to do this where I'm not creating a terrible security risk. And I also wanted to eliminate the need for people to have to think about how do I configure software and how do I buy hardware and how do I take responsibility for the physical security of this system and software and the cybersecurity issues. So it's a completely hosted service. People can sign up for it. It's messaging based. Today, what you can do is set a to-do, add to a to-do list, add reminders. You can send messages to other users. You can send messages to have it send message to yourself on a timed basis. It sends you a daily report. And so then I start adding to that. So I'm working on flights right now. The Amadeus interface is terrible.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm working on adding flight information, and eventually be able to allow you to buy flights, and then I'll allow you to book restaurants, and I'll allow you to access your calendar. Right, so I'm slowly easing into figuring out how to do this with a security surface that is manageable. So people are welcome to go try it out. Tell me what skills they want it to have, and let me know it's terrible or it's great. But it is really alpha. In a way that I think, people are seizing Cloudbot and using it in a way that it's really not mature enough to use. So I'm not doing that without.
Yeah, got it. So it's essentially you're adding a contact to your iMessage, and then you can chat with it and give it tasks, and it does it in an asynchronous manner.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, cool. That's an alpha alfie, so to say.
Alpha LP AALPI dot. Yeah.
Super
It's
interesting.
naming is crazy, right? I mean, Clawbot's not a great name either. So I take no umbrage if people say it's a terrible name. It's like, yeah, they're all terrible. ChatGPT, that's a terrible name too.
So people can try it out. I would love to back up a little bit to talk a bit about your experience in the AI space. You were a partner at Bain right off the start of the whole Gen AI hype in 23, 24. How do you look back at
21,
that?
22. I mean, actually, what's funny is we got introduced to OpenAI back in 2021. So I started using it during.
You were already experimenting with it much earlier than like when GPT-3 hit in end of 23, right? End of 22.
22, yeah. Well, ChatGPT was GPT 3.5. The ChatGPT interface was intended to try to make it easier for researchers and interested parties to help test some of the new features that were going to come out in GPT-4.
Yeah.
They had truly no expectation that it was going to have the explosive growth that it had.
Yeah,
because honestly, nothing before that had. I mean, my first API access was to GPT-2, and GPT-2 was pretty loony. You get some crazy, I mean, yes, these are English sentences, but
Yeah, didn't really get me into it. And so there was a time when everybody did the same use case kind of, right? So AI assistant pilots. In 23, like I remember that Bain and OpenAI worked very closely together at that time for enterprises. What are your lessons learned from that time, and what would you do differently today?
Well, I honestly wouldn't do anything differently. I think the work that we did at Bain for clients was really outstanding work. I mean, for a technology that was as early as it was and as unknown, we convinced major corporations in the world to launch public websites. So Coca-Cola was sort of the first one that we launched
I remember that.
back in 2023. I was not involved in building that. Just to give credit where credit is due, there's an amazing team of people at Bain that built that. But to imagine that, like within months after ChatGPT hitting it, hitting the global consciousness, that a major global corporation, Coca-Cola, would launch a worldwide campaign using the technology. Absolutely astounding. So I think, you know, real credit to the team at Bain for that and other similar projects. Lessons learned. I mean, I think one of the things we learned really, really early was the importance of evals. I mean, one of the projects I did work on um, was for a company in the healthcare industry, and we were looking at um, how to produce content that was consistent with regulatory guidance. And I won't go into all the details. And it was a proprietary project, and can't talk about everything. But I think one of the things that was really interesting is that by the time we actually had the whole system working, what we had is dozens of prompts, and every prompt had a eval prompt associated with it. So you would prompt and you would get a response, and you would have an eval prompt that would evaluate the response. And some of them had to be recursively generated. And so that pattern, that design pattern, we were already working on in 2023. And I think it's a core part of some of the things that have been done later, which we now call reasoning. But this sort of long running. I mean, in the case of the things we were building was very, very specific to a particular kind of task that an enterprise wanted to have done. And so obviously reasoning as an architecture is general purpose, but it's effectively saying the same thing. It's like, let me build a plan. Let me make sure in the course of executing that plan that I'm evaluating the steps and what's happened in the plan to see if I need to adjust the plan. Right. I think that was certainly one of the really early core learnings.
Yeah. How do you think about that? Like, how do enterprises now move from pilot to execution at scale? Like, what has changed in the meantime?
Yeah. So I see three things happening in the market. First of all, I think, and the most dynamic is there are companies that are AI native, right? They started with AI. They're taking AI as the way to build a new business. And so when they approach the work that would be done in a company, they approach it with a design language which begins with how am I using AI and automation to solve all these problems. The second thing I see happening is I see companies. General Catalyst is an interesting example. VC firm typically invests in high tech companies. They bought a hospital. Why did they buy a hospital? Well, they invest in a whole
Interesting.
bunch of healthcare AI, and what they decided to do was to have their own hospital so they could cut through all the bullshit and the bureaucracy and the resistance and say, no, you are going to use this AI tool. And so I think there's a bunch of really interesting experiments like that are going on. I've heard about one in legal, a small law firm that was acquired by a venture fund. And so I think we're going to see a bunch of existing businesses, but that are existing businesses at a scale where an investor, private equity or a venture capitalist can come in and say, we are going to transform the way you operate and turn you into a very different kind of company because of AI. And then the third thing that I see then is the established businesses, which I think in every industry, there tends to be some leader that is doing an amazing job redefining the way work is done in their business. And a whole bunch of laggards that are sitting there going, yeah, I don't know, is this really important? And I think two things will happen with those laggards. Either they'll start running really fast when it hits them that, no, this is actually working and those leaders are pulling away, or they'll cease to exist.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It feeds into your thesis that we will discuss in a few minutes. And I want to ask you about the time when you jumped in as the CEO at Inflection. So the management team, including Mustafa Suleiman, decided to leave Inflection for Microsoft. That was in May 24, I think. I think a lot of people thought, okay, that's going to be the end of Inflection. And then you and Reid Hoffman decided to pivot from consumer to enterprise. Can you walk us through that decision? What did you see back then that others didn't? And
Yeah.
what was it like to rebuild a team from the ground up?
Well, so first of all, I want to make sure the whole refounding team gets a lot of credit here. I think, Sean White was the first person that Reid brought in. Sean had been the head of research at Mozilla Foundation, and Vibhu, who had been the CEO of an education software company that Reed had invested in, and then Ian McCarthy, who had been senior product leader at LinkedIn. And so it was really the four of us that all came together in so March is when Mustafa and team left to go to Microsoft. And then it was between March and May that we put this plan together, the four of us, to restart the company. And I think that there were a couple of things that we saw at the time, and it's so hard. Here we are. What are we? February of 2026 now. So we're talking about, it was 2 years ago. 2 years ago, there was no open
Feels like a
source
decade.
LLM. It does feel like a decade. Yeah, so much has changed, right? And so, Inflection's original mission was to be a frontier model developer and compete at the level of an OpenAI and Anthropic and the rest. And I think, what we saw in early 2024 was that one of the things that was holding enterprise adoption back from using AI was the data security element and the lack of their ability to be able to own and control the infrastructure and the software to be able to run these models. And so we, I think, rationally for the time thought, hey, there's a great opportunity to have a model that we can actually deliver directly into enterprises where they can run it themselves. Now, the whole world changed, but that was the original insight. And along the way, I think, three things became apparent. One was that enterprises were going to be a lot slower in adopting. And so the ability for us to go and capture some market would be harder. Secondly, that the market really wasn't ready for pure enabling infrastructure, that they really wanted turnkey applications, right? Don't give me a thing that I can build an HR app on top of. Give me the HR. And then the third thing was, and maybe I should have said the first thing was the open source, right? So the open source then changes the dynamic of who is going to be successful in delivering those business applications. There are a number of reasons why companies should, at least for some purposes within their data processing infrastructure, and their own AI. And I think the 2026 answer is you need to be able to automatically manage AI workloads, to be able to introspect those AI workloads, to understand where they should be run. And, criteria might include cost. It might include the security issues. It might include capabilities. It might include performance or speed. It might include special capabilities that a given model has. But that there should be a routing mechanism that an enterprise runs. Sometimes it's run on an internal model because it's your quarterly earnings report that you haven't released yet. And sometimes it can be run on the public internet because you're simply writing an email to a customer.
Absolutely. Have you seen any solutions in that space, like optimized AI workload routing? Anything that you would recommend?
I don't know that anything's to the point of maturity where I would recommend it, but yeah, I've seen a dozen companies that have solutions around this topic. So yeah, and some of them are doing them very specific to an industry. So regulated industry like healthcare is going to be a different set of problems, right? And some of them they're different strategies. So some of them are introspecting the AI workload for things like HIPAA compliance, right? Which is a sort of a different issue than you're going to have. So thus it makes sense to be industry specific, a different issue than a retailer would have. But I think sort of the broad-based infrastructure is still ways to come. If I were to sort of compare this to the .com era, right? I mean, it took a while for us to go from, you wanted to have a website, so you have to build all the software to have a website on your own, which is what I was doing in 1994 and 1995, to, you have an app server, right? So building blocks are all there, which is what I was doing well, actually, I guess I was in the custom app business through 98 because Whoware, which was our company, we had our own custom stack. And then in 99 and 2000, we started working with, real app servers. And of course, today you can touch an API and go, oh yeah, I need a credit card processed. Oh, I need language translation. So that the maturity of the software stack will happen with AI as well, but we're in the very early days.
Got it. You surfaced some Wharton research a few months ago that shows that actually 75% of enterprises report a positive ROI from their AI initiatives, which is kind of contradicting the whole AI pilots don't scale narrative. And you said that AI will drive a larger wedge between organizations with plans and those without. What do you see? What are the winners and losers doing, and how do companies actually get an ROI and a competitive advantage from AI?
Yeah. So in a very simplified way, I think that there is a three-phase evolution that the leaders are using to move into fully transitioning their culture, the culture of their business, because I think this is a lot about people and a lot about culture, not about technology. So the first phase is education and experimentation. Companies are half-hearted about that. They isolate uh, pilots into a special team. A lot of companies have done co-pilot experiments, but with a limited number of people. And by the way, I think co-pilot hasn't aged well as a early AI technology. No offense intended to Microsoft, but a lot of people who came away from those co-pilot experiences were like, "Oh, well, AI sucks." It's like, well, no, your AI sucks. My AI actually works pretty well. So I do think that there's a bunch of mistakes that people make in that early education experimentation stage. Then the second stage, which most companies don't make it to, is what I call 80/20. And so the reality of the 80/20 world is you've got a technology that's reliable and can do work about 80% of the time. That still leaves 20% of the time that it is not reliable. So a lot of companies throw up their hands and say, "Oh my God, we can't use this because let's just keep doing it the old way because 20% of the time is way too risky." Like, no, you need to redesign the operating model so that you have all the safety mechanisms in place that the work, the 80% of the work is getting done still actually provides an economic benefit, even though you still need a whole bunch of people around to be doers to solve for all the exceptions and the mistakes and and all
Oh,
that,
yeah.
right? The 20%. But it done right, 80% that AI is doing is still a huge benefit. But the most important thing about going through that journey is the third phase, which you will not get to if you do not go through the 80/20 stage. The third stage is 99. And what I mean by 99 is 99% of the time it does it right.
Yeah.
And only 1% of the time is it screwed up. And then the really interesting problem for companies in going from stage 2 to stage 3 is you actually need a very different kind of person doing a very different kind of thing in the 99 case than in the 80/20 case. 80/20, I'm still like, people are in the workflow. They're approving things, reviewing things, doing things. 99, you're supervising. 99, you're overseeing the work and saying, "Oh, let me understand why in this corner case it didn't work. And let me actually fix." Analogy is in the self-driving car business, to come back to our Waymo thing. One of the things that researchers found, this is early on. There's lots of other examples, but this is a funny one. If you're on the freeway and your car is following another car that has a bike rack and has the bike on the back of the car, your car says, "Oh my God, there's a bike in front of me." Right? It's like, oh, well, that's a corner case, right? It doesn't happen very often, but we need to be able to build into the system that 1% of the time where I need to recognize that this is a bicycle as luggage attached to a vehicle, not a bicycle, somebody riding a bicycle, right? And so that 99 case is where your people are very analytical and they are problem solvers. And the work they're doing is figuring out why in that 1% things went wrong and fixing the systemic challenge so that the next time you don't have that same one.
You wrote an article about the Turing trap. It's the notion that organizations tend to over-index or over-optimize for automation versus augmentation because the ROI is much more obvious, right? And augmentation requires a lot of reimagining work. How do companies change that imbalance between hunting for the obvious quick win versus taking like a longer term view on what you can actually do to reinvent your whole business model?
Well, let me give you the tongue-in-cheek answer first, and then I'll try to give you a serious answer. The tongue-in-cheek answer is, "Hey, that's okay. Just go out of business," right? Because I mean, there's some level at which it's like, well, if you're not willing to actually do the hard work here of evolving to meet the market where the market has moved to, then you probably don't any longer deserve to have a place in that market. And so it's a little bit tongue in cheek, right? But this is why I lay out that three-part series, right? So phase 2 is very much about the augmentation, whereas phase 3 is really about the full automation. But in my view, it's very difficult to get to the full automation if you don't go through augmentation. My full prescriptive recommendation is Number one, in the experimentation education phase, you need to empower all employees, and it needs to be done in a way in which, as an organization, you are changing people's attitudes about the technology, which will then and help them with training change their behaviors, because attitudes and behaviors will ultimately change the culture of the company. And that will allow augmentation to be more successful. So employees will recognize that there's the very big activities like a contact center where we know we can go in and we can do a couple of things for a lot of people and get huge benefit. If you allow everybody to experiment with these tools, you'll also get the long tail. You'll get people actually fixing their own processes and tasks, and quality will increase and speed will increase and the quantity of things that people do will increase. Hard to measure, but it lays the foundation for then being able to move from 80/20.
You also thought a lot about the reshuffle framework. There was a recent book from Sanjay Choudhary, AI as a coordination mechanism in a company rather than a productivity tool. What do you say, what changes and what stays the same conceptually if you think about AI as a coordination mechanism rather than a tool?
There's a couple of things actually that I really like about the reshuffle book, and coordination is one of them. Let me though come back to that after touching on, I think the other really important thing for people to think about is this idea that jobs are a bundle of tasks, and they are bundled in the way that they're bundled because of a systemic structure for a business, or more likely a business within an industry. It functions in a particular way. When you have a fundamental environmental change, the systems then are going to change. And that's going to necessarily unbundle the tasks out of the jobs and cause you to then have to rebundle the appropriate tasks into those jobs again. Now, coming back to coordination, so the cost of coordination is one of the largest costs that a business faces, whether it's coordination in the sense of communication from employee to employee, or employee to vendor, or employee to customer, or the more complex things where you have ecosystems that a lot of companies, separate companies, have to interact. Like, it gets very, very complicated. And the reason that we have the M form organizational structure that started with, well, it started with the military, but from a corporate perspective, really started with the railroads, um, had to do with managing that cost of coordination. So I want to create a functional regional structure so that information can flow down and flow back up again, right? And we are now hardwired as a business culture and as a society generally into these M form organizations. Um, AI is a horizontal. Information flow is instantaneous across region, across function. And so there's this enormously challenging intellectual task that we have as business leaders to reimagine what the systems are for a business in which I no longer have the challenge of the regional and functional cost of coordination that causes me to be vertically organized. And how do I actually change to a horizontal organization? Going back to the job bundle, most of those job bundles, the tasks that are bundled are tasks which, I mean, in a certain sense, could be thought of as information compression tasks. And so this is the other thing that is radically different, is that I no longer need the human cognition to do the information compression task. And what I mean by information compression is, if I see a whole bunch of customer interactions and I see a pattern as a human being, I'm like looking for the pattern of like what's going wrong in the way in which we're interacting with these customers. And can I intuit then that we need to make a change in the packaging or whatever it is to solve this problem, right? That person who can do that is a highly paid person in our organization right now. So the reason I give you that example is it's a combination of that cost of coordination that I've got to actually look at all these conversations and gather all the information. And then it's also the synthesis. It's the information compression of, I now need to make sense of it, right? And the machine does both of those things. And so when you unbundle all the tasks, you're like, hey, I don't need the coordination tasks and I don't need the information compression tasks. What is left for the human to do, which we can come back to, what left for the human to do gets rebundled, right? But I've now actually had to change to a very different organizational structure. An interesting example is market research. Do I want to have a sample set of phone calls to a sample set of customers to gather a sample set of responses to, should I make the product green or yellow, right? Well, I mean, yeah, that's the way we've always done it. Why have we done it that way? Because of the limitations of what's possible. because I can't possibly call all of my customers. Well, but wait, AI can call all of your customers. Hey, would you rather see the next product coming out be green or yellow? Right? Ask that a billion times.
What has changed towards how people perceive AI today?
There are two ways of thinking about that question. I'll answer the more usual one first, and then I'll give you the more correct one. The more usual one is, how do I improve coordination, use AI to improve coordination amongst people? Okay, well, there are all sorts of things I can do. I can say, let me look at this piece of information and figure out who else needs to know it. Like AI can do that. Let me take a whole bunch of different pieces of information and synthesize it and provide the synthesis of all that information rather than the individual bits of information. That can be done too. How do I uh, um, streamline the collection of the information in the first place, right? That can be done. Like the example of asking the question green or yellow, right? So there's lots of ways in which I can reduce the cost of coordination when I think about it from the perspective of, yeah, I have all these people and how do I improve their coordination? Actually, though, the correct answer is, how do I actually use AI to just do the end-to-end task without ever involving the people? And then I don't have a cost of coordination. So that is a very different design parameter. And so much work has gone into, well, let's analyze the way that our company does this particular work.
Mhm.
And then let's figure out in the way we do the work today, where we can put AI or automation to make that work done the same way, faster, cheaper, better. It's like, no, don't ask that question. Ask a different question. Say, I have these inputs, I have these outputs that I want. What would be a new optimal way to go from inputs to outputs? I don't care how you do it today. Let's come up with a new way of doing it that leverages the strength of machine intelligence.
Super interesting. You turned into a second time author slash content creator now, and you launched adaptability.com, giving practical exercises in order to build adaptive capacity. And you said that career advice is mostly useless because it doesn't really teach you how to adapt. How do you build the learning space for someone who's eager to learn about how to adapt to the pace of change and how to stay relevant in the workspace?
Yeah. Well, I say that most career advice is useless because most career advice starts with the premise of, what should my child study in college? What career should they be thinking about? Right. It's very much about sort of role and activity and task. Whereas actually, what I think we need in a period of time in which the world is going to continue to change very rapidly is we actually need to have a different set of behaviors and attitudes. So learning adaptability is really about learning those behaviors and attitudes. And some of them are things that are pragmatic things to do, like experimentation. If you haven't gone and used Opus 4.5, how can you possibly have an opinion about what the best AI can do? Like you got to go and use this stuff all the time. Obviously different people will come to this with different economic and psychological and practical things, like the amount of time they have in order to do these things. That's a specific example of behavior. More deep things that I'm trying to cover in, I'll call it a book. That's what a book is. Adaptability are things about understanding how we learn and what are the things that become barriers to learning. So, for example, one of the things I write about in the book is, if you're tired, if you're exhausted, you're not going to learn. Don't smash your head against a difficult thing that you're trying to absorb or get an understanding of when you're exhausted. And exhaustion doesn't have to be like, I'm tired and I need to sleep. Exhaustion can just be, I'm overwhelmed with data and I just need to take a walk, right? So we have to be able to put ourselves in a mental state. And this is, so this is the other piece of adaptability, is understanding who we are as biological creatures and what we're capable of and what tools that we have available to us to put ourselves in a position where we can adapt. And so I started this project as a book and then wrote a whole manuscript, started talking to publishers, and realized books are terrible. You can hardly reach anybody with a book, I mean, comparatively to the web, right? And they're static. And so I said, look, actually, this needs to be a website. It needs to be a mobile application. There's a whole set of interactive community-based tools that are needed. This is a very mission-driven thing for me. This is not about, not that any book publisher makes a lot of money. It's like, I wasn't going to get rich writing a book, right? And it's not about money. It really is. It was actually started in a conversation I had with my wife, in which we were talking about what are the things that we can do to give back to society that are anchored in what we know. Like if I was an immigration lawyer, I know exactly how I'd be spending my time right now without getting into the politics. I'm not an immigration lawyer. What I am is somebody who's spent decades in transformation programs around technology and the impact it has on society and organizations and individuals. And so if I can help people in this time of incredibly rapid change, do a better job individually, be more adaptable individually, then I will have really given back. So that's my mission.
That's an interesting mission. Most people building AI education platforms focus on teaching people how to use AI. Like you have a prompt engineering course, you get to see how ChatGPT works, these kinds of things. You chose to focus on a meta skill adaptability. What's the difference between teaching someone to use the tools of today versus teaching them how to adapt when those tools change every 3 weeks?
There is something inherently challenging about writing a very pragmatic technical course when the tools themselves change out from under you while you're teaching the course. I've actually been talking with the university about teaching non-programmers how to be successful using vibe coding tools. And I went through this whole thing where I described what the class was I wanted to teach and what the curriculum would be. And I thought I'd be teaching it actually right now, spring semester of 2026. And they're like, "This is great. We're going to put it in the catalog for fall of 2026." I'm like, "Okay, well then I need to entirely rewrite the curriculum." They're like, "What?" I'm like, "Everything's gonna be different by then." Like, come on. So it's not that I don't like or don't care about the specific hands-on tools and tasks, but rather that, yeah, by going to the meta skill of adaptability, what I am trying to do is give people a set of behaviors that allow them to adjust with the way in which the world changes. I think we will see more innovation in AI in 2026, and it will be more impactful to work, society, and us as individuals than it was in 2025. And again, it'll be more so in 2027. And so that relentless pace is only going to increase. And so this is where I really feel that we desperately need the coping mechanisms, but even more importantly, the thriving mechanisms to be able to keep up with that pace of change.
Do you think that there is a way that we are just getting outpaced? It's just developing too fast and we don't even have a chance to capture what is happening anymore, right? So if technology is accelerating at exponential speed of light, if you will, what do you do as an individual?
Yeah. So let me give you an analogy. 1992, 93, I was already involved in what we now call the worldwide. And I was on a mailing list. Wow, mailing list. I received emails regularly once a week. And in each weekly email, it would list the couple of websites that had been built by somebody in the world that week, right? Think about that now. How many websites got launched in the course of this conversation, right? Can you imagine getting an email every time a website got created? And so what had to change was the cognitive model for how we interacted with the information about what was happening with the world, right? It was no longer a mechanism where I could follow it via email. Now it's a mechanism in which I follow it using search engines. And the same thing I think is going to be true of AI. Like we're at this very early stage where there's all sorts of things happening, and the technology is changing rapidly. And those of us that are in it early are doing the same thing of like following the email every week, right? Oh, this right now we're talking about Claudebot or is it OpenClaw? I can't keep up, right? But that's all going to change, right? Most people don't want to have to know what the best model is to do a task or what the best system built around a model is to do a task. They just want to get the task done, right? And so we're going to need this intermediation, like the search engine, for the simple example I gave, where people will be able to go to a thing and say, here's a task I want to get done. And that's ultimately what I think is interesting about Claudebot is I think it does show a future way and what I'm trying to do with Alpi. Is it shows a future way where you have an intelligent assistant that's keeping track of that complex set of new capabilities. So I'll go to Alpi and say, hey, can you book me a dinner reservation? And they'll say today, no. Hopefully when I get done with the coding in a week, it will. It will be able to do a dinner reservation, right? That's going to be the change in the way we interact with the information. I think that is why I care so much though about adaptability as a topic and why I talk about the behaviors that need to change. Sometimes I talk about this as the revenge of the liberal arts. right? So when I was at young, 1.5 million years ago, when I was a child, we would talk about the revenge of the nerds. And why? Well, because as somebody who was good at math and science and
Yeah.
learning computer programming, I got no dates. All the football players got the dates, but we're like, we're going to get them back because we're going to be the ones that make all the money. And those pretty girls are going to want to be with us, or, whatever the stupid thing was that we were saying in the 1970s and 80s. But now we're so much smarter. We're so much smarter because what we realize is none of those technical skills are going to matter, right? What really matters, and I don't know that the football players are good at this either, but what really matters is interpersonal relationships and empathy and critical thinking and creativity. And so I think there's a set of things that we can focus on as human beings that are going to remain really valuable human tasks or activities or capabilities, which will be amplified by our technology, whatever the level of the technology that it gets to at any given moment. And so that's what we focus on. That's the switch, the cognitive switch that needs to happen. I talk about this a little bit in the economic bitter lesson about like what should people be doing right now, right? There's a set of things around what we valued in the past around credentials and experience, the development of heuristics that aren't going to matter anymore.
You consistently said that in the AI age, people should focus on three things, right? Critical thinking, creativity, and connection collaboration, right?
Yeah.
And recently you've extended that list with strictly human leverage, and that includes community, trust, positioning, taste, judgment under ambiguity, synthesis that depends on lived context, and leadership in emotionally complex environment. Let's say, let's try to break this down. Let's say I'm a proactive and adaptive knowledge worker. How do I actually redesign my work to align with your framework?
Well, I think that there are a couple of starting points. One is, how do you choose the place that you are trying to add value in the economy? So if I am adding value by being an enterprise salesperson, if I just I'll take software as a category, right? So I'm at an enterprise software company. If I am adding value as an enterprise software salesperson, the activities that I am engaged in that are going to be the most valuable are the relationships that I create with those customers, because that's the thing that's going to be difficult to supplant with the machine intelligence. One of the things I do is I advise a lot of startups. Super fun. I really enjoy this work. I was just talking with one of my advisory companies who is talking about how they've moved a whole bunch of their technical skills offshore. And their CEO was asking the question of like, where do I stop? Like, what do I keep onshore versus what goes offshore? And I said, well, I think that there are two things to take into consideration here. One is all of those people in your organization that you would call salespeople or customer success people, like having them onshore, having them close to customers, able to relate to them about saying, hey, like we're showing up at the restaurant or showing up at the event or whatever it is, like that physical engagement. Events are going to be so much more important. Like the highest value job payment will be for those roles. Now, there's a second piece. So that's the internal to external. There's also an internal to internal. So I said, look, if you're offshoring, you've got people in India and Manila and Czech Republic or wherever it is. That's great from a cost perspective, although obviously that will get eroded as well by AI. But what you lose is the serendipity of innovation interaction. It's very hard. We do a terrible job of recreating the kind of serendipity moments that can happen when we're in person, when we are all on structured Zoom calls or Slack messaging. And so to the extent that the roles are really core creative and interpersonal, again, the interpersonal relationship, you want those people to be present together. And so I kind of backing into the answer from an individual perspective. So the individual perspective is like, hey, I need to be participating in something where creativity and critical thinking and communication are really important parts of what is being bundled into the job. And I need to figure out how to shed those things that are about information compression or coordination.
You just published the economic bitter lesson, which is quite a pessimistic view about whether macro or political solutions can address AI-driven inequality. Or you borrow Rich Sutton's work around bitter lessons from AI research. What is Sutton's original lesson, and why does that insight translate into the broader economy?
Yeah. Well, so his original insight is that as researchers, what we've tried to do is come up with novel, creative innovations that are going to increase the capabilities of our machine intelligence programs. What has happened again and again is that actually the real unlock for increasing capabilities was more compute. So if I abstract the observation, what it's saying is that scaling matters more than specific narrow insights. Like, I think there are broad insights, right? Like the transformer model was a broad insight, right? So it's not as if there's nothing that AI researchers have contributed. Clearly, there's a lot of things they're doing, um, but I do think it's sort of an interesting point to then say, how do I then take that to the next level of abstraction, right? The next level of abstraction is, well, hey, scaling compute unlocks not just capabilities, but also through unlocking capabilities, eradicates economic value, right? And so the scaling law causes us to recognize that in the competition for certain kinds of cognitive work, that humans will no longer be able to compete, right? So that plays into the Thomas Piketty conversation around how the return on capital investment can increase faster than the growth of the overall economy because because of a shift in where the value accrues. And so if I'm the owner of that capital, in this case, the LLMs, I'm going to capture a greater share of the value than other participants in the economy, especially those participants on the tail end of the economy who are being depositioned altogether from positive economic contribution. But even the people who are workers in those businesses are not going to accrue value at the same pace, right? And then you have everybody in between. And so the combination then sets up a scenario in which we face a world in which there will be growing inequality. And so then the question becomes, what's the solution for growing inequality? And the common solution, the positive outlook that folks like Peter Diamandis will promote on Moonshots on his podcast is abundance. In fact, Peter wrote a book called Abundance. And lots of people have talked about this topic of abundance. And my observation is that abundance doesn't automatically mean that people participate in that abundance, right?
Mhm.
Abundance can simply mean that Elon Musk becomes a trillionaire faster, not that I get to be a billionaire, right? Or not that the average person in the street gets to have a high income. And so then you say, well, what are the things that we can do to change that dilemma? And so then that's where I lay out what I call my macro, meso, micro model. So the macro is, hey, these are things you're not going to change. So you're not going to change that computation is going to eradicate economic value in a whole set of cognitive tasks. And you're not going to change the fact that what that means is that the owners of that capital are going to accrue value faster than the growth of the overall economy. So that gives us the meso, which is policy. Effectively, like, okay, great. Change the way we tax billionaires. Let's change the way we tax bots, right? And the challenge there is we each have a vote. We can participate and collaborate on solutions and ideas. We're going to get pushback. We already are getting pushback. Even, you can take the range of billionaires out there and say folks like Reid Hoffman are maybe the most sympathetic. And even they are saying, no, you can't do a billionaire tax, right? Clearly, the wealthy class doesn't have an interest in voluntarily saying, hey, here, please take all my money. And so that's going to be fraught with difficulty. And so my point in the piece was not to be pessimistic, but to be realistic, but realistic in a pragmatic way of saying, but there is something you can still do. Right. And that's where I come to the micro. The micro is where you have real agency, where you can say, I'm going to do this for myself. And so I think the urgent thing for each of us to be doing is to reposition ourselves in the economy such that we are not dependent on the things that are going to be eradicated and instead are deriving value from the things that are going to grow in value.
Yeah, let's get into that. You also say that adaptability is unevenly distributed. It depends on resources like time, capital, networks. We talked about relationships, psychological bandwidth. Those people who most need adaptability are probably the ones least likely to have those resources. Shouldn't we also be thinking around collective action tools to help people organize and advocate for change?
Yeah. So now you're back at the meso.
Yes.
It's not that I've given up hope changes in policy, which, by the way, doesn't have to be limited to regulatory change at governmental level. It can also be policy in a company. Right? What does our company value and reward? Yes, we do need those collective action opportunities in organizations, in the society at large. My primary point was simply like the thing that you have control over today is yourself. But yeah, even yourself. And by the way, I would disagree a little bit with your framing of the people who need adaptability the most or the people that least have the resources available. We actually all need it. And I'm not going to pick on any particular belief group. So fill in your own blank for a group that has a strong set of beliefs. They may be societal beliefs or religious beliefs or whatever. There are lots of reasons why people who have these strong belief structures are not going to adapt, right? The Amish culture is a beautiful thing. If you've gone and seen the wagons, and they may be perfectly happy forever living in that way without taking on the conveniences of modern technology and being connected to the networks and all the rest. I have no beef. And so my point is like, they may have the least availability of the resources, but also don't need it more than you and I need it. You and
Yeah,
I, we don't have to participate in the network, right? Our light is
absolutely.
nuclear.
There's an asymmetric notion in the impact of AI. So we don't know who's going to be the most affected by it, job wise, or even like in your personal life, right? So everybody needs to find their way into adaptability, kind of to make a living in the future and to live like a meaningful, purposeful life. I want to dive a bit into the notion of compute as a special kind of capital, as you mentioned it. So it substitutes cognitive labor, still requires massive upfront investment, and it replicates near zero marginal costs. That's quite a proposition. Physical capital also has some of those properties, right? So you also require massive investment, and the marginal costs, depending on how far you scale it, they get lower and lower. Why is computational capital so different, and what changes when capital stops being about making things and starts being about replacing thinking?
Yeah. Well, the thing that I don't talk about in this essay, which will be an important rejoinder, and I do need to write something soon about it, is physical robotics, because there's a corollary here. In fact, Elon Musk has recently been talking about XAI as the digital Optimus, right? There is a really interesting there's a cognitive robotic automation and there's physical robotic automation. And the impact of those as a different form of capital are similar. And so why is it a different form of capital? Well, 76 was a really interesting year, right? There was this strange thing, this experiment that started in the American colonies. And then there was also this book that came out called The Wealth of Nations. I love that book. I actually go back and reread it periodically. I think it's just there's so many levels of brilliance. And part of what is being described in The Wealth of Nations is this new interaction in society between the people that own the goods and the means for converting the goods, converting raw materials or assemblies into finished goods, versus the labor that actually handles the raw materials and handles the machinery for manipulating the raw materials, right? And so we've lived in this really interesting world for 250 years in which capital needed labor and labor needed capital, and governments of a variety of kinds found different strategies for trying to manage the relationship between capital and labor, right? And I think the success of the West over that period of time was largely because the balance that we found of using a democratically elected leadership to navigate the differences of opinion between laborers and capitalists resulted in a more prosperous society for all members. What this new form of capital does is it decouples labor from the equation of value creation. So where Marx may have complained about how capital captured too much of the value and didn't leave enough value for the laborer, the complaint that Thomas Piketty raises is capital captures all of the value. So cognitive first, because the solving for the digital problem is easier than solving for the physical problem, but physical soon, as we have robotics. And then laborers are no longer at that table equal to capital, and government doesn't have the same balance of relationship to manage. And so we enter an entirely new phase of human existence in which we have some really critical decisions to make about what is the nature of capital, what is the nature of the rest of the populace that doesn't have access to capital, who mediates the relationship, what's the system of mediation.
Lots of interesting questions. I wonder in that new regime, who will be the winners? Like, will it be, as you say, a small elite that will own the compute and capture the benefits? Are these the NVIDIA shareholders? Do we need to stock up more NVIDIA in our portfolio? Are these the founders of the frontier AI labs? Who are the winners?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I definitely think that broad-based stock ownership is one of the ways in which our society navigates the transition of value creation. And an interesting debate is about, gee, OpenAI going public, Anthropic going public. No, they absolutely should go public. We should all have an opportunity to own those companies. Redistribution of wealth, which you can label taxes or you can label
Dividends.
dividend. Well, so there are lots of ways to think about how we redistribute. To my mind, there's these competing ideologies that we shouldn't burden the industrialists with taking their money to distribute to the non-industrialists because the industrialists are creating the value that drives the economy. And I think that debate goes up against, the Marx or Eugene V. Debs or whoever you want to throw into the bucket saying, but wait, the reason that the industrialists are capable of creating wealth in the first place has to do with there being laborers and there being markets to sell their goods into, and there being the infrastructure like the highway system. So there's all these public goods that we need to fund and we need to support, right? I think that debate just becomes extraordinarily difficult to continue in its current form when you devalue labor as a part of the equation of value creation. And so something very different has to emerge around this new world of abundance where we actually do understand how to distribute abundance in a way across society that ultimately lifts everyone in society up. So my personal framing of this is based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I've been using for 2 decades now as an explanation for what a civil society should look like. A civil society should ensure that every person has safety, has food and shelter, probably internet. We can decide what's at the base of the pyramid. That's a minimum baseline that we don't even do today. Go back to Johnson with his demand that we consider what, as a rich society, we ought to be doing for every member of society. We still haven't managed to do it. In fact, we're going backwards right now, right? And we need to do it not just on a national basis, we need to do it on a global basis. Every person on the globe, the first objective should be we satisfied Maslow's hierarchy of needs at the base, that base level of the pyramid. And then what we should be doing is we should be saying, great, now we should be enabling every human to also then have an aspiration for more. And so then you do need a mechanism, right? You need to be able to say, well, I'll give you a great example, artists. So let's specifically talk about music, right? I have a friend who's a musician, and he and I were actually just having this debate over the weekend about the fact that what allowing AI model companies to do in taking all of the music that's been created and training models that can generate music on all that music. What that does is it fundamentally just eradicates the economic ability for musicians to do their activity. Whereas actually what we should be doing is we should be creating a system in which musicians are encouraged to create more music. Right? I don't think we need to give whichever corporation owns the Eagles music more money. Right? But what we should be doing is that kid who's out there in New York City, where I'm sitting here right now, who's on a street corner doing a beat and trying to get some attention for like his personal genius. We should be figuring out how to reward him, and we need to reward every creator, and we need to reward them commensurate with the appreciation of their creation. Right.
Mhm.
So I do think that there is an economic model that isn't simple, give everybody the same for everything they do. Right. But we should give everybody the minimum and give everybody the opportunity to get more, and have a mechanism by which when you try to do something that creates more, that you commensurate with your ability and your commitment and your grit, that you get more. Now, do we need trillionaires? Maybe this podcast is not long enough for us to discuss whether or not anyone should be a trillionaire.
Yeah, that's probably for another time. I love the adaptability thinking. I'm also trying to pursue the same course here with the podcast to make people more aware of what's happening in AI. I think one thing to consider is also the notion of, hey, everybody can become an investor and become a shareholder in those companies now. It's going to be owners of the compute across the world, right? So I think there's also this notion, how can labor evolve into capital? And that there's an interplay between the two, right? I need to be adaptive, but I also can jump onto the other train, also depending on my resources, right? That's the limiting factor that I have.
Yes, or yes, but. So let's take Anthropic. So Anthropic, and I only pick on them right now because they're doing a fundraising round right now. So they're going to raise $30 billion or whatever at a valuation that's twice the valuation that they were at in September, you know, just 6 months ago. Just a question. Did you get a chance to put any money in on that round of investment or the one in September?
Yeah.
No, I didn't either. Weird. I mean, that's where all the value creation happened, right? Like we're going to have to wait till they go public and then what, right? So then the people that it got the privileged people, the capital controllers in our economy made money in September and they're going to make money again now. And the money they're going to make will be our money when we buy it when it goes public. And now I'm not saying that it's a bad idea to buy it when it goes public. It might be a great idea because it may double again, but we will have missed out on multiple rounds of doubling, right? We're not participating equally in the economy. The people who have the wealth are making more money faster than the rest of us.
Absolutely.
It's, we've created a system in which inequality is increasing.
So to develop that even further, one would need better access to the private markets, be it in venture capital or in private equity, right? You mentioned the roll-up VCs now that go into like buying hospitals and then augment them with AI and leverage the technology there. I think what we need is to rethink the financial access for the broader mass.
You know, we could have this mechanism in which some portion of the increase in value that those early capital investors earn, some portion then gets reinvested back in the society to be able to do things like provide food, shelter, security, education. Oh, wait, I think that's called taxes.
It's the
Right?
redistribution mechanism, yeah.
Yeah, because ultimately we're just arguing about different redistribution mechanisms. You're saying, oh well, do we have
Yeah.
access to investment? You know, taxes is another way of solving the same problem. I'm not saying there's any one good perfect way to solve the problem, but I think that your finger's on exactly what the problem is. Right? The problem is that certain portions of society, because they already have access to capital, are going to benefit disproportionately from this evolution of labor to cognition. We don't have a mechanism today for making sure that as a society as a whole that we all benefit from this transition. And without that, we are going to face a time of, I think, increasing societal unrest.
Talking about societal unrest, I've been following your work for quite some time. And in your earlier writing, you talked a lot about augmenting humans, keeping humans at the center of AI. So I would say a rather optimistic perspective. You mentioned that you would phrase it as now you have a more realistic view about what's happening at the macro, meso, and what needs to happen at the micro level. I just wonder what has caused that to adjust, and how do those two Ted Sheltons kind of reconcile?
There is a ship of Theseus metaphor to bring in here. I don't know if you know the ship of Theseus, but I'll leave that to the side for the moment. I am still the Ted Shelton that I was.
Yeah.
Mostly. I think there's a through line there. I'm still optimistic about what the role that human beings play in a society that increasingly is benefiting from cognitive surplus, to use Clay Shirky's old term, right? Um, the reason that I wrote the piece that I wrote, again, was not to be pessimistic. It was to be pragmatic about, like, hey, the one thing you actually do have control over is yourself. What the hell are you doing right now? And I'll tell you, actually, honestly, one of the reasons why I was motivated to write it was this whole Claudebot thing, not to bring us back full circle to a conversation at the beginning of this podcast, but I put a poll up on LinkedIn about, what were people doing about Claudebot? Were they rushing out as a weekend project to install it, or, what were they doing, right? By far, the highest number of people responding to that poll said, I'm doing nothing. It's not interesting. And I'm like, wrong behavior, alert, alert.
And you have a selection bias probably in your connections.
Well, my selection bias actually should be toward people doing things, not to
Exactly.
people not doing things. Yeah. So if you take the population as a whole, right, most people have no idea what's going on with Claudebot, right? Much less think that it's a bad idea and don't want to do anything. I mean, some of the people that said do nothing have a principled reason to say, look, I don't want to have an exposure of that security risk and all the rest, which is fine. And like the way I do it is it does not have my passwords. It does not have my credit cards. Like there is a different way to do it, but you still want to experiment. You still shouldn't be not interested. You should be interested, right? And so I guess my point in the bitter economic lesson is you are not going to be saved by suddenly the world being different, macro, or suddenly there being a bunch of really smart policies, meso, right? The only way you individually are going to be saved is micro. It's going to be something you go and do for yourself. Go do it. Stop sitting on your hands. Get it done. And so I think from that perspective, it actually is a continuous through line of optimism. I'm still optimistic that individuals can do something to be relevant and productive and valued in a post AI economy.
Excellent. My last question is about you being a grandfather. What is the what is the future vision that brings you hope that your grandchildren will also be living a meaningful, exciting life?
Well, as soon as Elon Musk remembers to give me that $1 billion he owes me, then I can give it to my grandsons. And no. So a couple of thoughts on this. First of all, my oldest grandson is 3 years old now. So they've got a long journey ahead of them in a world that's changing rapidly. And the world that they're going to grow up in is fundamentally different than the world, for example, my children grew up in. My oldest daughter's 30 now. When she was 7 or 8, I don't know if you remember a little device called the Danger.
No.
It was a handheld smartphone, for lack of a better word. It didn't have voice. It only had texting, and it was sort of like a BlackBerry for kids. And so I made sure my kids had them. Right. I mean, so one of the things, going back to access to adaptability, is not evenly distributed. One of the things I am fortunate about is that for my grandchildren, that I have a position in society, my family is capable of making sure that they have the affordances and the education to be able to understand how the world is different and how they navigate that. And part of my mission, my strong mission driven objective in creating adaptability.com, was to try to say, what can I do to take that same capability that it's easy for me to provide to my family, but provide it to everyone? Like, what's the form I can do that in? Obviously, I can't give everybody the Danger phone. But I can give people information. I can arm them with knowledge and make it easy for them to absorb and all the rest, right? So for my grandchildren, I think that's the first piece, is that they will actually have access to resources and knowledge and a different way of learning. The second thing, though, is I am very optimistic at the meso level that we are going to adapt our institutions, and that I think it can happen in the time. So like, if I take a 3-year-old and I say, what's the world gonna be like 10 years from now when he's 13? Like, I think school will be very different when he's 13. I think that institution will have changed. So I am optimistic about the meso, even if I didn't emphasize it in that one piece. And I think work is going to change, education is going to change. I think politics and government is going to change, and it will change on the scale of decades, which frankly is much faster than it's ever changed before in human history. And I'm partly optimistic about that because I think this is actually one of the few times where we've invented a technology which is, while being disruptive itself, also a capacity for assisting us in navigating the disruption, right? So the internet was a little bit like this because it gave us access to the world's information. The weaving machine was not like this at all. Like, I didn't learn how to use a weaving machine by there being a weaving machine, right? I can learn how to use AI by there being AI. So I'm optimistic that our pace of change at the meso scale is going to be a lot faster.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Ted. This was a very intellectually stimulating conversation. I learned so much today. What can people do to learn more about your work?
But they can follow my newsletter, Infinite Future. And the easiest way to subscribe to that is to find me on LinkedIn, Ted Shelton, and then right at the top of my profile is a link to the subscription button. They can also come to adaptability.com and explore the journey there. And I welcome feedback. Part of why I'm excited about being a website is that I can change it. So if you find a mistake or you suggest something that I should add or change, I can do it. And so please make it a two-way conversation. And then thirdly, I'm going to keep doing I have about 20 projects I'm working on, LP being one of them, but I would love for people to get involved in testing things like LP, AA, LPI.ai, and tell me what skills you want, and I'll go build them. And we'll have an continuously improving AI assistant to help us in our lives. So those are 3 ways to connect with me right away.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ted, for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you. And thanks everyone for listening or watching today. That's it from AI to Go. Thank you. Bye-bye and auf Wiedersehen.
AI to Go podcast.